The eviction notice felt like sandpaper between Marcus Chen's fingers as he read it for the seventh time that morning, the courthouse steps cold beneath his worn work boots. 3 days. That's all the time he had left before his family would be living in their rusted Honda Civic, circling the block like vultures waiting for something to die. The irony wasn't lost on him. A man who'd spent 15 years building houses for other people couldn't keep a roof over his own family's head. His phone buzzed against his chest pocket, and he already knew it was Sarah calling from the diner, where she'd been pulling double shifts for the past month. Her voice would have that carefully controlled tone she used when talking about money, the one that made her sound like she was walking across thin ice, testing each word before she spoke it. He let it go to voicemail. What could he tell her that she didn't already know? The construction company had folded 3 months ago, taking his steady paycheck with it. The small renovation jobs he'd been picking up barely covered groceries, let alone the $2,400 monthly rent on their cramped 2-bedroom apartment. The courthouse lawn stretched out before him, autumn leaves scattered like discarded lottery tickets across the brown grass. Other people moved with purpose. Lawyers in sharp suits, clerks with armfuls of paperwork, families heading to various proceedings with the look of people who still believed the system might work in their favor. Marcus felt like he was watching them through glass, separated by the simple fact that they had somewhere to go when this was over. His daughter Emma's school supplies list was folded in his wallet, right behind the eviction notice. $43.68 for basic supplies. Notebooks, pencils, glue sticks. The kind of mundane expenses that used to be automatic, barely worth thinking about. Now, each item felt like a small mountain to climb. She'd been so excited about 3rd grade, had spent the summer practicing her cursive writing on the back of old construction invoices he'd brought home. The thought of having to tell her they might not be able to afford her school supplies, might not even have an address to put on the enrollment forms, made his chest feel like it was being crushed in a vice. The October wind carried the smell of wood smoke from somewhere in the residential neighborhoods beyond downtown, where families were probably starting their first fires of the season, settling in for cozy evenings with hot chocolate and homework spread across kitchen tables. Marcus pulled his jacket tighter and tried to remember what that kind of security felt like, the luxury of planning beyond the next meal, the next tank of gas. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from his brother Danny in Portland. "How's the job hunt going? Things are picking up here in construction if you want to make the move." Danny meant well, but the suggestion felt like a knife twist. Move where? With what money? And uproot Emma from the only school she'd ever known, the only friends she'd made since the divorce. He stood up and walked toward the parking meter where his Honda waited, its paint job a patchwork of rust spots and touch-up attempts. The car had been making a grinding noise for 3 weeks now, the kind of sound that meant expensive repairs were lurking just around the corner. He'd been putting off taking it to a mechanic, knowing that whatever was wrong would cost more than he had in his account. That's when he saw the newspaper box, its metal door hanging open like a mouth mid-yawn. The local weekly paper's headlines usually dealt with city council meetings and high school football scores, but today, something different caught his eye. Rural Properties Auction, Bank Liquidation Sale. He fed 2 quarters into the slot and pulled out a copy, scanning the list of addresses and minimum bids. Most of the properties were clearly disasters, flood-damaged houses, condemned buildings, lots with environmental issues. But one listing made him pause. 47 acres, Hillside property, Millbrook Township, water rights included, minimum bid $500.
47 acres. Marcus had never owned more than the small deck behind his apartment, but he'd grown up visiting his grandfather's farm outside of town. He remembered the feeling of space, of possibility that came with land that stretched beyond what you could see from your front porch. More importantly, he remembered his grandfather's stories about the Depression, about how owning land, any land, gave a man options when everything else fell apart. The auction was scheduled for tomorrow morning at the county assessor's office. Marcus folded the newspaper and slid it under his arm, his mind already racing through the logistics. He had $347 in his checking account, another $180 in savings that was supposed to be Emma's emergency fund. If he could somehow scrape together $600, maybe sell his tools, his grandfather's watch, something, he could at least make a bid. The drive back to the apartment felt different now, charged with the possibility of action instead of the passive dread that had been his constant companion for weeks. Sarah's car wasn't in the parking lot yet, which meant she was still at the diner, probably counting tips and calculating whether they could afford both groceries and gas for the week. Inside their apartment, the walls seemed closer than usual, the ceiling lower. Emma's artwork covered the refrigerator, crayon drawings of houses with smoke curling from chimneys, families holding hands in front of picket fences, all the domestic stability that felt increasingly like fairy tales. Her backpack sat by the door, ready for school tomorrow, stuffed with library books about pioneers and settlers, kids who'd loaded everything they owned into wagons and headed west looking for better lives. Marcus spread the newspaper across the kitchen table and studied the auction listing again. Millbrook Township was about 40 minutes outside of town, up in the hills where the air was cleaner and the night sky wasn't washed out by streetlights. He'd driven through there once or twice for construction jobs, remembered rolling farmland and houses set back from the road with long gravel driveways and mailboxes that actually had names painted on them instead of just apartment numbers. The smart thing would be to focus on finding another job, maybe swallow his pride and ask Danny for a loan to get through the next few months. But Marcus had been doing the smart thing for 15 years, playing by all the rules, working steady and saving when he could, and where it had gotten him. 3 days from homelessness, with a daughter who still believed her father could fix anything. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts, looking for anyone who might have some work available, some way to earn a few $100s in the next 18 hours. There was Mike Torino, who sometimes needed help with weekend landscaping jobs, Janet Morrison, who'd mentioned wanting to refinish her deck before winter, even Mrs. Chen from the apartment complex, who'd been talking about cleaning out her garage for months. The front door opened, and Sarah walked in, her waitress uniform wrinkled and her hair pulled back in the practical ponytail she wore during long shifts. She looked tired in the way that went deeper than physical exhaustion, the kind of weariness that came from smiling at customers while wondering if their tips would cover the electric bill. "Emma's at my sister's until 8, she said, hanging her purse on the hook by the door. "Thought we could talk without little ears listening." She noticed the newspaper spread across the table and raised an eyebrow. "Job listings?" "Something like that." Marcus folded the paper so the auction notice was visible. "What would you say if I told you I had an idea that sounds completely crazy, but might be our only shot at getting out of this mess?" Sarah sat down across from him, her expression shifting from tired to wary. "I'd say that's exactly the kind of conversation that scares me most these days." But she leaned forward anyway, reading over the auction listing. 47 acres for $500? "Marcus, what's wrong with it?"
"I don't know yet. That's what makes it crazy." He reached across the table and took her hand, feeling the calluses from carrying heavy plates and the small burn mark near her thumb from a coffee pot mishap last week. "But I keep thinking about what your dad used to say about having something to fall back on, someplace to go when the rent gets too high and the jobs disappear." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying the newspaper like it might reveal some hidden catch in the fine print. "How much do we have? If I sell my circular saw and the nail gun, maybe enough for the minimum bid." "It's a gamble, but Sarah, we're already gambling. We're betting that I'll find steady work before they throw us out, betting that the car won't break down, betting that Emma won't get sick or need something we can't afford." She pulled her hand away and walked to the window that looked out over the apartment complex parking lot, where their neighbors were coming home from their own jobs, their own daily struggles with bills and uncertainty. "And if we buy this land and it turns out to be worthless, if there's some reason nobody else wanted it, then we'll figure it out. We'll camp on our own property until I can build us something better than this." Marcus gestured around the apartment, with its thin walls and broken garbage disposal and the perpetual smell of other people's cooking. "At least we'll have options." The conversation continued through dinner, peanut butter sandwiches and canned soup. And into the evening after Emma came home, full of stories about her cousins and questions about whether they were really going to have to move soon. They talked in careful code, using phrases like new opportunities and changes coming up, while Emma colored at the kitchen table, her head bent over a drawing of what looked suspiciously like a farm with a big red barn. That night, after Emma was asleep, Marcus lay in bed calculating and recalculating the numbers. The pawn shop would give him maybe $200 for his good tools. Sarah had some jewelry from her grandmother that might be worth something. There were unemployment checks still coming, sporadic work from Mike Torino, the possibility of picking up some quick cash doing day labor at the construction supply store. By morning, the plan had taken on the desperate clarity of a man jumping off a cliff. Marcus was up before dawn, making coffee in the kitchen while Sarah got ready for another shift at the diner. The auction started at 10 a.m., which gave him enough time to hit the pawn shop and still make it to the county building with whatever money he could scrape together. "You sure about this?" Sarah asked, straightening his collar like she used to do when he left for job interviews, back when job interviews still felt like possibilities instead of formalities. "No," Marcus said, kissing her forehead, "but I'm sure about us, and I'm sure that doing nothing isn't working anymore." The drive to the county assessor's office took him through the parts of town where he'd built houses during the good years, past developments with names like Creekside Estates and Heritage Hills, where young families were starting their lives with mortgages and minivans, and the kind of optimism that comes from believing the future will be better than the present. The auction room was smaller than he'd expected, just a few dozen folding chairs facing a podium where a clerk was arranging paperwork. Most of the other bidders looked like real estate investors or contractors, people with the kind of casual confidence that came from having money to lose. Marcus clutched his envelope of cash, $623 after selling his tools and Sarah's wedding ring from her first marriage, and tried to look like he belonged there. When they called Lot 47, the Hillside property in Millbrook Township, Marcus felt his heart hammering against his ribs. The auctioneer rattled off the basic details: 47 acres, zoned residential agricultural, water rights included, sold as is with no warranties or guarantees. "Do I hear 500? Marcus raised his hand, the gesture feeling both momentous and terrifying. 550? Silence. 525? Still nothing. Sold to bidder number 12 for $500. Just like that, Marcus Chen owned more land than he'd ever imagined possible. The paperwork took another hour, fees and taxes bringing his total to $623, exactly what he had in the envelope. When he walked out of the building, deed in hand, he felt like he was carrying the weight of his family's future in a manila folder. The drive to see the property took him up winding mountain roads where the houses grew farther apart and the mailboxes had names like The Johnsons and Sunset Ridge. The address led him to a gravel turnoff marked by a tilted wooden post with faded numbers painted on it. The driveway, if you could call it that, was more of a dirt track that disappeared in the trees and brush. Marcus parked at the bottom and walked up the hill, pushing through overgrown blackberry vines and ducking under low-hanging branches. What he found at the top made him stop and catch his breath. The land opened up into a natural meadow that sloped gently down toward a creek he could hear but not see through the trees. In the distance, mountains rose against a sky so blue it looked like something from Emma's crayon box. It was beautiful. It was also completely wild, without a single structure or improvement visible anywhere. No power lines, no well, no septic system, nothing that would make it habitable for a family with a 7-year-old daughter and a shrinking bank account. Marcus sat down on a fallen log and pulled out his phone to call Sarah, but there was no signal up here. For the first time since buying the property, he felt the full weight of what he'd done. He'd spent their last $600 on 47 acres of wilderness, gambling everything on a piece of land that might take years and thousands more dollars to make livable. But as he sat there in the silence, broken only by the sound of wind through the trees and the distant murmur of the creek, something inside him settled into a kind of peace he hadn't felt in months. This was theirs now. Whatever came next, whatever challenges waited ahead, they would face them on their own land, with their own sky overhead and their own ground beneath their feet. The walk back to the car felt different than the walk up, each step carrying the weight of ownership, of responsibility, of possibilities both terrifying and wonderful. Marcus Chen had made the biggest gamble of his life, and only time would tell whether he'd saved his family or doomed them all. The first night on the property, Marcus lay in the back of the Honda with Emma curled against his side, listening to Sarah's quiet breathing from the front seat and the unfamiliar symphony of night sounds filtering through the cracked windows. Owls called to each other across the darkness, and something, probably a raccoon, rustled through the underbrush near the creek. Every sound felt amplified in the silence, reminding them how far they were from streetlights and sirens and the comforting white noise of civilization. Emma had been a trooper about the whole thing, treating their first night camping on their own land like the greatest adventure imaginable. She'd helped Marcus clear a small area near what seemed like the flattest spot on the property, gathering rocks for a fire ring while chattering about all the animals they might see and whether they could build a treehouse in the big oak tree that stood like a sentinel at the edge of the meadow. But Sarah's silence spoke volumes. She'd packed their essential belongings with the grim efficiency of someone loading a lifeboat, her movements sharp and controlled in the way that meant she was holding back everything she really wanted to say. The conversation about Marcus's purchase had been brief and tense, conducted in whispers after Emma fell asleep in the motel room they couldn't afford for more than one night. "So what's the plan?" she'd asked, sitting on the edge of the bed while Marcus spread county maps across the scratchy comforter. "How exactly do we turn 47 acres of wilderness into a place where our daughter can do homework and take baths and have friends over?" Marcus had traced the property lines with his finger, trying to project confidence he didn't feel. "We start small. Get a camping permit from the county while we figure out the septic and power situation. I can build us a basic shelter, something to get us through winter, then work on a real house when the money starts coming in."
What money? Sarah's voice had cracked on the words. Marcus, you just spent our last $600 on land we can't live on, can't sell, and can't develop without thousands more that we don't have. Now, lying in the car with his daughter's breath warm against his neck, Marcus wondered if Sarah had been right. The October night air was sharp with the promise of winter, and even through their sleeping bags he could feel the cold creeping through the car's thin metal walls. What would they do when the first snow came? When Emma caught a cold from sleeping in temperatures that dropped below freezing? When Sarah finally reached her breaking point and demanded they find somewhere else to go? Morning brought coffee made over an open fire and Emma's delighted discovery of deer tracks in the mud near the creek. She followed them like a detective, narrating her findings to anyone who would listen, while Sarah packed their overnight supplies with mechanical precision. "I need to get to work," Sarah said, checking her phone for the time. "Jenny's covering my morning shift, but I can't miss the lunch rush." She looked around at the wild tangle of trees and brush that surrounded their small, cleared area. "Will you two be okay up here?" The question carried more weight than it seemed to. What she was really asking was whether Marcus had completely lost his mind, whether his plan extended beyond buying land they couldn't afford and hoping everything would somehow work itself out. "We'll be fine," Marcus said, helping Emma climb into the front seat of the Honda. "I want to walk the whole property today, see what we're working with, maybe find a better spot for a permanent camp." The drive down the mountain felt like leaving a foreign country. By the time they reached the elementary school, Emma's excitement about their camping adventure had given way to the practical concerns of being 7 years old in a world that expected you to show up clean, fed, and ready to learn. "Daddy, when can I invite Kaylee to see our new house?" Marcus knelt down to her level, smoothing her hair that still smelled like wood smoke from their campfire. "Soon, sweetheart. Daddy needs to build it first, remember? Just like the 3 little pigs." Emma nodded seriously, apparently satisfied with this explanation, and ran toward the school building where other children were arriving in clean clothes from houses with running water and central heating. Marcus watched until she disappeared through the front doors, then drove Sarah to the diner in a silence that felt like a held breath. The Mountain View Diner occupied a corner lot downtown, its neon sign flickering against the gray October sky. During the construction boom, Marcus had eaten lunch there regularly, part of the crew that filled the back booths with talk of lumber prices and weekend plans. Now, the familiar smell of coffee and bacon grease made his stomach clench with hunger and something that felt dangerously close to shame. "I'll pick up Emma at 3:30, Sarah said, gathering her apron and name tag from the glove compartment. "Try to find us somewhere to stay tonight that has a roof." The words stung, but Marcus knew they came from fear rather than cruelty. Sarah had married him because he was steady, reliable, the kind of man who showed up for work every day and paid bills on time. This new version of Marcus, the one who made impulsive decisions based on newspaper ads and gut feelings, was territory she'd never had to navigate. Alone in the Honda, Marcus drove back up the winding mountain road with a mixture of dread and anticipation. In daylight, the property looked different. What had seemed romantic and full of possibility in yesterday's golden afternoon light now looked overwhelming in the harsh clarity of morning. Everywhere he looked, he saw problems that needed solving. Trees that would have to be cleared, drainage issues that could turn their meadow into a swamp, slopes too steep for safe construction. But he also saw potential. The creek that ran along the eastern edge of the property was clear and fast-moving, fed by mountain springs that probably ran year-round. The southern slope got full sun from morning until late afternoon, perfect for a garden or solar panels if they ever got that far. And the big oak tree that Emma had spotted was actually part of a small grove that could provide both lumber and a natural windbreak for whatever structure he managed to build.
Marcus parked the Honda in the shade and began walking, trying to see the land not as an amateur camping enthusiast, but as a construction worker who'd spent 15 years turning raw lots into places where families could build their lives. The skills were transferable, he told himself. The principles of foundation and framing, of running utilities and creating proper drainage didn't change just because you were starting from scratch instead of following architectural plans drawn up by someone else. By noon, he'd identified 3 possible building sites, each with different advantages and challenges. The spot near the creek would be beautiful, but potentially problematic during spring flooding. The highest point on the property offered incredible views, but would be expensive to access with power and water lines. The middle ground, a gentle rise about a quarter-mile from the road, seemed like the most practical choice, though it would require clearing several mature trees. Marcus ate lunch sitting on a fallen log, sharing a peanut butter sandwich with a curious chipmunk while he sketched rough floor plans on the back of an envelope. Nothing fancy, just a basic cabin with 2 bedrooms, a kitchen area, and a bathroom that could be expanded later if money ever stopped being a constant worry. He estimated materials costs in his head, trying to remember lumber prices and whether he still had contacts in the supply business who might be willing to work out some kind of payment plan. His phone buzzed with a text from Danny in Portland. "How'd the auction go? You buy that place?" Marcus stared at the message for a long time before typing back, "Yeah, it's going to be an adventure." The afternoon brought a visit from their new neighbor, a weather-beaten man in his 60s, who introduced himself as Frank Morrison and explained that his family had owned the adjacent property for 3 generations. He drove up the dirt track in a pickup truck that looked older than Marcus, parking at the edge of their clearing with the casual confidence of someone who belonged in places where roads weren't paved and the nearest grocery store was 40 minutes away. "Heard somebody finally bought the old Henderson place," Frank said, climbing out of his truck with the careful movements of someone whose joints had logged a lot of hard years. "Been empty since old Pete passed 5 years ago." Marcus shook hands with Frank, grateful for human contact that didn't involve explaining why his family was living in their car. "Marcus Chen, my wife Sarah, daughter Emma. We're still figuring out our plans." Frank nodded, studying the small camp Marcus had set up near the oak grove. "Pete always said this was good land,
Just needed someone with the gumption to make something of it. You planning to build? That's the idea. Start with something basic, see how it goes. Well, you picked a good spot for it. Frank gestured toward the rise where Marcus had been considering his cabin site. High enough to stay dry, close enough to the road for utilities if you ever want to run them up here. Pete always talked about drilling a well somewhere around there, said the water table ran pretty close to the surface. The conversation continued for an hour, Frank sharing local knowledge that would have taken Marcus months to figure out on his own. Which contractors in the area were reliable and which ones to avoid, where to get gravel for the access road and lumber at prices that wouldn't bankrupt a working family, how to navigate the county's building permit process without getting buried in bureaucracy. You got any experience with this kind of project? 15 years in construction. Houses mostly, some commercial work. Never built from scratch on raw land, but I know which end of a hammer to hold. Frank laughed, the sound carrying genuine warmth. That's more than most folks who try this kind of thing. My son Tommy runs a sawmill about 10 miles from here, cuts local timber. You need lumber? He'll treat you fair. Just tell him I sent you.
When Frank left, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in months. The sense that he wasn't completely alone in figuring out an impossible situation. There were people in this community, neighbors who understood what it meant to build something from nothing and were willing to help others do the same. The pickup of Emma and Sarah at 3:30 brought him back to the immediate reality of their situation. Emma bounced into the car full of stories about show and tell and playground drama, but Sarah looked exhausted in the way that went beyond physical tiredness. "How was your day?" Marcus asked, navigating the Honda back up the mountain road. "3 tables stiffed me, and the coffee machine broke during the lunch rush, so everyone was cranky about waiting for their caffeine fix." Sarah stared out the passenger window at the trees rushing past. "Made $43 in tips, barely enough to cover gas and groceries for tomorrow." Emma, oblivious to the tension in the front seat, chattered about her teacher's announcement that parent conferences were coming up in 2 weeks. "Mrs. Patterson wants to meet with you and Mommy to talk about my reading progress. Can she come see our new house too?" Marcus met Sarah's eyes in the rearview mirror, seeing his own panic reflected there. Parent conferences required an address, a phone number, some evidence that Emma was living in stable housing with responsible adults. What would they put on the school forms? GPS coordinates for a patch of wilderness where they were camping illegally until Marcus could figure out how to make it livable? That evening, around a campfire that provided more atmosphere than actual warmth, the 3 of them ate dinner off paper plates and tried to pretend their situation was temporary adventure rather than growing desperation. Emma roasted marshmallows and told stories about the fairy kingdom she was building near the creek, complete with houses made from acorn caps and bridges constructed from twigs. Sarah helped with the fairy architecture, but Marcus could see the worry in her eyes every time she looked at their daughter. Emma was adapting to their circumstances with the resilience of childhood, but what would happen when the novelty wore off? When she realized that other kids went home to houses with bedrooms and homework desks and all the boring comforts they'd taken for granted just a week ago. After Emma fell asleep in the Honda, Marcus and Sarah sat by the dying fire, wrapped in a blanket they'd borrowed from Sarah's sister, trying to plan for a future that felt increasingly uncertain. "I talked to my manager today," Sarah said quietly, "about picking up extra shifts, maybe working some doubles. Jenny's been wanting to cut back her hours anyway." "Sarah, you're already working 6 days a week. When would you sleep?" "Same time Emma does, I guess." "Marcus, we need income. Real income. Not just the occasional job here and there. The diner's offering me 40 hours a week if I want them, plus overtime opportunities." Marcus poked at the fire with a stick, watching sparks spiral up into the darkness. "What about Emma? She can't stay up here alone while we're both working. My sister said she could watch her after school, at least until we get settled somewhere. And there's that after-school program at the elementary school, if we can afford it." The conversation continued past midnight. 2 people trying to solve an equation with too many variables and not enough resources. Every option they considered seemed to create new problems. Sarah working more hours meant less time with Emma, but they needed the money to survive. Marcus focusing on building their shelter meant less time looking for paying work, but they needed somewhere to live. Emma staying with relatives meant stability and safety, but it also meant their family spending more time apart when they needed each other most. "Sometimes I wonder if we should just cut our losses," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Find someone who wants to buy the land, take whatever we can get for it, use the money to rent an apartment somewhere." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. "You want to give up?" "I want our daughter to have a normal life. I want to stop lying awake at night wondering if we're going to freeze to death because her father decided to bet everything on 47 acres of wilderness." Sarah turned to look at him, firelight flickering across her face. "I want to believe you have a plan that extends beyond hoping everything works out." The accusation hung in the air between them, and Marcus couldn't argue because part of it was true. He had been operating on hope and desperation, making decisions based on gut feelings rather than careful calculation. But what was the alternative? Going back to their old life of month-to-month rent payments and jobs that disappeared without warning? Living with the constant anxiety of never being more than one missed paycheck away from disaster? "The land gives us options," Marcus said finally. "Even if everything goes wrong, even if I can't build us a house or find steady work, we own something. Nobody can evict us from our own property."
They can if we don't pay the property taxes. They can if we're living here illegally without proper permits. They can if Emma gets sick and we have to choose between medical bills and keeping the land. Sarah stood up, brushing dirt off her jeans. "I'm going to check on her." Marcus stayed by the fire until it burned down to glowing coals, staring up at stars that seemed closer and brighter than they'd ever looked from their apartment balcony. The silence was broken only by night sounds that were gradually becoming familiar. The rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the distant call of an owl, the soft whisper of wind through the trees. Tomorrow he will start building. Not because he had a perfect plan or unlimited resources, but because the alternative was giving up on the only chance they might ever have to create something permanent, something that belonged to them completely. The land was theirs now. 47 acres of possibility and problems in equal measure. What they made of it would depend on how much they were willing to risk, how much they were willing to sacrifice, and whether love and determination could compensate for the money and experience they didn't have. Marcus banked the coals and walked to the Honda, where Emma was sleeping peacefully in the back seat. Her face relaxed in the way that only children could manage when the adults around them were holding the world together through sheer force of will. Sarah was awake in the front seat, staring out at the darkness with the expression of someone trying to see a future that remained stubbornly invisible. "We'll make it work," Marcus said, settling into the driver's seat beside her. "I don't know how yet, but we'll figure it out." Sarah didn't answer, but she reached over and took his hand, holding it tight against the uncertainty that surrounded them like fog. Outside, the mountains stood guard over their small family, 47 acres of land that represented either salvation or the biggest mistake Marcus had ever made. Only time would tell which one it would prove to be. The next few weeks would test everything they thought they knew about themselves, about each other, and about what it really meant to build a life from scratch. But for now, in this moment, they were together on land that belonged to them, under stars that seemed close enough to touch, holding on to each other and hoping it would be enough. The first snow came 3 weeks earlier than anyone expected, blanketing their makeshift camp in 6 inches of wet, heavy flakes that turned their world into a postcard that was beautiful to look at and miserable to live in. Marcus woke to the sound of Emma coughing in the back seat of the Honda, a deep, rattling sound that made his stomach clench with the particular terror that comes from knowing your child is sick and you have no way to make them better. Sarah was already awake in the passenger seat, her breath forming white clouds in the frigid air inside the car. The camping heater they'd bought from Walmart had run out of propane sometime during the night, and ice crystals had formed on the inside of the windows, turning their shelter into something that felt more like a refrigerator than a home. "Her fever's back," Sarah whispered, touching Emma's forehead with the back of her hand. "It's worse than yesterday." Marcus climbed out of the car into ankle-deep snow, his joints protesting against the cold as he fumbled with numb fingers to light their camping stove and start water boiling for coffee. The thermometer nailed to the oak tree read 18 degrees, and the wind coming down from the higher peaks cut through his jacket like it was made of tissue paper. Emma had been fighting what the school nurse called a respiratory thing for 5 days now, missing classes while she alternated between fevered sleep and coughing fits that left her exhausted and scared. The free clinic in town had given them antibiotics and advice about keeping her warm and hydrated, but implementing that advice was proving nearly impossible when home was a 12-year-old Honda parked in a clearing that might as well have been on the surface of the moon.
"We need to take her to the hospital," Sarah said, emerging from the car with Emma wrapped in every blanket they owned. Their daughter's face was flushed with fever, but she was shivering so hard her teeth chattered. "We can't afford the hospital," Marcus said, though even as the words left his mouth, he knew how they sounded. The clinic said to keep her warm and monitor her breathing. Look around, Marcus. Does this look like a place where we can keep a 6, 7-year-old warm?" The argument that followed was conducted in harsh whispers, while Emma dozed fitfully against Sarah's shoulder, neither of them willing to voice what they were both thinking. That their grand adventure and self-reliance was turning into something that could genuinely endanger their daughter's life. The hospital would mean bills they couldn't pay, questions about their living situation that they couldn't answer, and possibly a visit from Child Protective Services that could destroy their family more thoroughly than poverty ever could. But Emma's breathing was becoming more labored, and the fever wasn't responding to the children's Tylenol they'd been rationing like it was liquid gold. Marcus looked at his wife holding their daughter in the front seat of a car that was slowly filling with snow through the gaps around the doors, and felt something break inside him that had been holding together through sheer force of will. "Get her dressed," he said, stamping out the camping stove and throwing their gear into the trunk with movements sharp enough to express the anger he couldn't direct at anyone in particular. "We're going to the hospital." The drive down the mountain was a white-knuckle nightmare of switchbacks and ice, the Honda's worn tires struggling for traction on roads that the county plows wouldn't reach until sometime after lunch. Emma cried quietly in the back seat, her small voice barely audible over the heater that was finally starting to produce warm air now that they were moving. Valley General Hospital sat on the edge of town like a brick and glass monument to all the things that went wrong when people didn't have enough money or insurance or luck. Marcus had driven past it hundreds of times during his construction years, never imagining he'd be carrying his daughter through the emergency room doors with no idea how he was going to pay for whatever happened next. The waiting room was full of people who looked like they belonged there. Tired parents with sick children, elderly patients with the resigned expressions of people who spent a lot of time in medical facilities, working folks who'd been injured on the job and were navigating the complex intersection of workers' compensation and medical bureaucracy. Emma's fever spiked to 103 degrees while they waited, and suddenly the triage nurse was moving them into an examination room with the kind of efficiency that meant something was seriously wrong. The doctor was younger than Marcus had expected, with the kind of earnest competence that reminded him of Emma's teacher. "Pneumonia," Dr. Reyes said, after listening to Emma's chest and reviewing the x-rays that cost more than Marcus made in a week of odd jobs. "She's going to need antibiotics, probably a few days to see improvement. Are you able to keep her somewhere warm and quiet?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus and Sarah exchanged looks across Emma's hospital bed, both of them calculating the same impossible equation. The truth would bring questions they couldn't answer. A lie would put Emma at risk if her condition worsened. "We're staying with family right now. Temporary situation while we look for a permanent place." Dr. Reyes nodded, making notes on Emma's chart, but something in her expression suggested she'd heard similar stories before. I'm going to give you my card. If her fever doesn't break within 48 hours, or if her breathing gets worse, I want you to bring her back immediately. And I mean immediately, regardless of...
The emphasis on that last word told them everything they needed to know about how transparent their situation really was. The bill for Emma's treatment came to $847, not counting the prescription medications that would add another $120 to their debt. Marcus signed paperwork with a hand that shook slightly, authorizing charges to a credit card that was already maxed out and promising to make payment arrangements for amounts he had no realistic way of covering. By the time they got back to the property, the snow had stopped falling, but the damage was done. Their camping area looked like a disaster zone, with gear scattered by wind and small animals that had investigated their supplies while they were gone. Worse, the Honda's battery had died from running the heater overnight, leaving them stranded on their own land with a sick child and no way to get back to civilization if Emma's condition worsened. "This isn't working," Sarah said, standing in the snow while Marcus tried to jumpstart the car with cables borrowed from Frank Morrison. "Marcus, this isn't working, and we're going to lose her." The words hit him like a physical blow because they echoed the fear that had been growing in his own chest since Emma first started coughing. They were in over their heads, playing at pioneer life, while their daughter paid the price for their stubbornness and desperation. "What do you want me to do?" Marcus asked, his voice coming out harsher than he'd intended. "Go back to town and rent an apartment? With what money? Apply for jobs that don't exist? We tried that, Sarah. We tried playing by their rules and it got us evicted." "At least when we were evicted, Emma had a warm place to sleep and medicine when she got sick." Sarah's voice was rising, and Marcus realized this was the fight they'd been avoiding since the day he bought the land. At least she could have friends over and do homework at a kitchen table instead of in the back seat of a car. Emma stirred in the Honda's back seat, awakened by their raised voices, and both parents immediately lowered their voices and softened their expressions in the way that parents do when they realize their child is witnessing their world fall apart. "Are we going home now?" Emma asked, her voice still rough from coughing but clearer than it had been in days. "This is home, sweetheart," Marcus said, though the words felt like lies in his mouth. "Daddy's just trying to fix the car." Frank Morrison's truck appeared at the bottom of their driveway like salvation with four-wheel drive, and Marcus had never been so grateful to see another human being in his life. Frank took one look at their situation, the dead car, the scattered camp, Sarah's red-rimmed eyes, and Emma's pale face, and started issuing orders with the kind of calm authority that came from decades of dealing with mountain winners and families who were learning the hard way what it meant to be truly self-reliant. "Get the girl and whatever gear you need for tonight," Frank said, already hooking jumper cables to the Honda's battery. "You're staying at our place until this weather breaks and we can get you properly set up here." Sarah started to protest. They barely knew the Morrisons, and accepting charity felt like admitting defeat. But Frank cut her off with a wave of his hand. "My wife Betty is already making up the spare room. Emma can sleep on our granddaughter's old bed, get herself properly warm for the first time in weeks. No arguments." The Morrison house was everything their own future home aspired to be, a solid, practical structure that had weathered 40 years of mountain storms and raised 3 children who had all turned out to be productive and successful adults. Betty Morrison fussed over Emma like she was her own granddaughter, feeding her homemade soup and setting her up in front of a fireplace that radiated the kind of heat that seemed to penetrate all the way to a person's bones.
Over dinner, Frank and Betty shared stories about the early days of their marriage, when they'd lived in a trailer while Frank built their house by hand, working construction jobs during the day and framing walls by lamplight in the evenings. Their tales of frozen pipes and generator failures and winters when they'd heated their home with a wood stove in sheer determination made Marcus and Sarah's current struggles seem both less catastrophic and more surmountable. "Every family that makes it up here goes through something like this," Betty said, refilling Sarah's coffee cup for the 3rd time. "The mountain tests you. Make sure you really want to be here. Those that stick it out usually find something they didn't know they were looking for." That night, sleeping in a real bed for the first time in weeks,
Marcus lay awake listening to Emma's breathing slowly return to normal in the room next door. Sarah was curled against him, her body finally relaxed after weeks of tension and hypervigilance, and for the first time since buying the property, Marcus allowed himself to imagine what success might actually look like. The conversation with Frank the next morning over coffee and eggs changed everything. Frank had been thinking about their situation, he said, and had a proposal that could help solve several problems at once. "I've been wanting to dig a well on my back 40 for years," Frank said, gesturing toward the eastern edge of his property that bordered Marcus's land. "A spring up there would be perfect for irrigating the lower pasture, maybe even running a line to the main house for backup water. But I'm getting too old to take on that kind of project by myself." Marcus saw where this was going and felt his pulse quicken with something that might have been hope. "I've got a buddy with a drilling rig, owes me some favors from way back. What if we partner up on this? You provide the labor, help me get my well dug, and I'll help you with yours. Cost to the drilling gets split between us, and you get the experience of seeing how it's done before we tackle your property." The offer was generous, almost to the point of charity, but Frank presented it as a mutually beneficial business arrangement that allowed Marcus to accept help without feeling like he was begging. More importantly, it gave him something concrete to focus on, a project that would move them closer to making their land truly livable. The drilling began the following Monday, after Emma's fever finally broke and she was healthy enough to return to school. Marcus drove her down the mountain each morning, then returned to work alongside Frank and Danny Kowalski, the drilling contractor who'd been sinking wells in the area for 30 years and had opinions about everything from water table depths to the best techniques for installing hand pumps. The work was physically demanding in a way that felt both familiar and foreign. Marcus had spent 15 years swinging hammers and hefting lumber, but operating drilling equipment required a different kind of strength and precision. His hands were soft from weeks of unemployment, and by the end of the first day, his palms were raw with blisters that would callus over into the kind of permanent ridges that marked a man who worked with his hands for a living. But there was something deeply satisfying about the rhythmic process of drilling. The steady percussion of the bit biting into rock and soil, the gradual accumulation of cuttings that told the story of what lay beneath the surface, the moment when the drill suddenly dropped and everyone knew they'd hit water. Frank's well came in at 42 feet, producing a steady flow of clear, cold water that tasted like it had been filtered through miles of mountain stone. The celebration around the drilling rig felt like a victory not just for Frank, but for all of them. Proof that the mountain would share its resources with families willing to work for them. "Your turn," Danny said, already planning the move to Marcus's property. "From what Frank tells me, you're looking at a similar depth, maybe 50 feet on the outside. Ground up there's good drilling, not too much bedrock, decent water table." The prospect of having their own water source felt like the first major step towards making their land genuinely livable. Marcus spent that evening sketching plans for a simple cabin, trying to figure out how to build something that would keep his family warm and dry through a mountain winter without requiring skills or resources he didn't possess.
Sarah had been cautiously optimistic about the well project, but the reality of their situation became clear when Emma came home from school with a notice about parent-teacher conferences and a permission slip for a field trip that required an emergency contact with a local phone number and address. "We need to figure out the school situation," Sarah said, sitting at the Morrisons' kitchen table with forms spread in front of her. "Mrs. Patterson is asking questions about Emma's absences, and I'm running out of excuses that don't involve explaining that we're homeless." The word hung in the air between them, stark and undeniable despite all their efforts to avoid it. Homeless. Not camping, not temporarily relocated, not pursuing an alternative lifestyle. Homeless. With a 7-year-old daughter whose health and education were suffering because her parents had bet everything on a piece of land they had no realistic plan for developing. Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. Every decision he'd made over the past month had been motivated by the desire to provide security for his family. But the results spoke for themselves. Emma had missed 2 weeks of school due to illness that might have been prevented if they'd been living somewhere with adequate heat. Sarah was working double shifts to pay for medical bills they couldn't afford, and their marriage was being tested in ways that felt increasingly unfair to everyone involved. The drilling on Marcus's property began on a Tuesday morning in early November, with frost still covering the ground and the promise of more serious winter weather lurking in clouds that gathered around the mountain peaks like gray wool. Marcus had chosen a site about 200 yards from where he planned to build the cabin, close enough to run water lines, but far enough from the building site to avoid any complications during construction. Danny's drilling rig was an impressive piece of machinery, a truck-mounted apparatus that could punch through 60 feet of soil and rock with the steady determination of something that had been designed for exactly this purpose. The sound of the drilling was rhythmic and hypnotic, a percussion that seemed to echo off the mountain slopes and announced to the world that the Chen family was serious about making this place their permanent home. The first day of drilling produced mostly soil and clay, the kind of material that indicated good drainage and stable ground for building. Marcus worked as Danny's assistant, learning to read the cuttings that came up with each bit rotation, understanding how the color and texture of the material told the story of what they were drilling through. By lunchtime, they'd reached 28 feet, and Danny was optimistic about hitting water within the next 2 days. Marcus allowed himself to imagine the moment when clear mountain water would bubble up from their own well, the first step toward creating a homestead that could sustain his family through whatever challenges lay ahead. That afternoon brought visitors that changed the entire trajectory of their project. A white sedan with government plates navigated the rutted access road with the careful precision of someone who wasn't used to driving on surfaces that hadn't been paved, and Marcus felt his stomach drop as he recognized the logo on the door: Department of Health and Human Services, Child Protective Division. The social worker was a tired-looking woman in her 50s named Janet Holbrook, who climbed out of her sedan with a clipboard and the kind of expression that suggested she'd seen every possible variation of family dysfunction and wasn't easily shocked by anything she might encounter. "Mr. Chen, I'm here about a report regarding the living conditions of your daughter Emma. I understand she was recently hospitalized for pneumonia." The interview that followed was conducted with Emma at school and Sarah at work, leaving Marcus to explain their situation to someone whose job was to evaluate whether they were fit parents. He tried to present their circumstances in the best possible light: the land ownership, the well drilling project, the plans for permanent housing. But Janet Holbrook had clearly dealt with desperate parents before and wasn't easily swayed by optimistic projections. "I need to see where Emma is currently sleeping," she said, following Marcus to the Honda that still served as their primary shelter. "And I'll need documentation of your income, your housing plans, and Emma's medical care."
The inspection of their living situation was humiliating in ways Marcus hadn't anticipated. Janet Holbrook examined their camping setup with the methodical thoroughness of someone compiling evidence, taking notes about the lack of running water, the inadequate heating system, the absence of proper sanitation facilities. She asked questions about Emma's school attendance, her social development, whether she was maintaining friendships with children who lived in conventional housing situations. "Mr. Chen," she said finally, closing her notebook and looking at him with something that might have been sympathy, "I understand that you're facing financial difficulties, and I can see that you're working hard to improve your family's situation. But I have to be concerned about Emma's welfare. She's missed significant school time due to illness that may have been preventable. She's living in conditions that don't meet basic standards for child safety and health." Marcus felt the ground shifting beneath his feet in a way that had nothing to do with the drilling rig still operating nearby. What are you saying? I'm saying that unless you can demonstrate significant improvement in Emma's living situation within the next 30 days, we're going to have to consider alternative arrangements. Temporary custody with relatives, foster placement, whatever serves Emma's best interests. The threat was delivered in the calm, professional tone that social workers used when they were breaking apart families for their own good. But Marcus heard it as clearly as if she'd shouted. They had 30 days to transform 47 acres of wilderness into something that qualified as suitable housing for a 7-year-old girl, or they would lose their daughter to a system that specialized in separating families who couldn't prove their fitness according to middle-class standards. After Janet Holbrook left, Marcus sat on the tailgate of Danny's truck, watching the drilling operation continue with mechanical precision while his world fell apart around him. The steady percussion of the drill bit seemed to mock him now, a countdown to a deadline he had no realistic way of meeting. Danny noticed his distraction and shut down the rig for an impromptu coffee break. Rough conversation? Marcus explained the situation in broad terms, trying to make it sound less catastrophic than it felt. Danny listened without comment, then walked to the edge of the drilling site and studied the ground like he was reading a map written in soil and stone. How much time did she give you? 30 days. And what do you need to make her happy? A house, running water, electricity, heat, basic safety features. Everything we don't have and can't afford to build in 30 days. Danny was quiet for a long moment, then walked back to the truck and started pulling tools from the equipment compartment. Well, let's see what we can do about the water situation first. Everything else gets a lot easier once you've got a reliable well. The drilling resumed with new urgency, as if Danny understood that they were racing against more than just the approaching winter. By evening, they'd reached 45 feet, and the cuttings were showing the kind of moisture content that indicated they were close to hitting the water table. Sarah arrived home from work to find Marcus sitting by their campfire with a 1,000-yard stare, and she knew immediately that something had gone seriously wrong. The conversation that followed was conducted in whispers while Emma played with her dolls in the Honda, both parents trying to process the reality that their experiment in alternative living had attracted the attention of people who had the power to destroy their family. 30 days? Sarah repeated, like she was trying to make the words make sense. They want us to build a house in 30 days? Not a house, just something that meets their standards for child welfare. Running water, heat, basic safety features. With what money, Marcus? We've got maybe $200 in the bank and a credit card that's already maxed out. Even if you could build something in 30 days, which you can't, where would we get the materials?
The fight that followed was the one they'd been building toward since the day Marcus bought the land. All the frustration and fear and accumulated resentment that had been growing between them as their situation became increasingly untenable. Sarah accused Marcus of putting his pride ahead of their family's welfare. Marcus accused Sarah of giving up too easily, of not believing in their ability to make their situation work. Emma listened from the car with the kind of wide-eyed attention that children give to adult conversations they're not supposed to hear but understand are about their future. The argument ended with Sarah crying and Marcus stalking off into the darkness, leaving Emma to ask the question that cut through all their adult rationalizations. Are we going to have to give up our house and move somewhere else? This isn't our house yet, sweetheart, Sarah said, wiping her eyes and trying to sound more confident than she felt. Daddy's still building it. But what if he can't build it fast enough? The question hung in the cold mountain air like a challenge, and neither Sarah nor Marcus had an answer that didn't involve admitting that their daughter might be smarter than both of them combined. That night, Marcus lay awake in the Honda, listening to his family sleep and trying to figure out how to build a miracle in 30 days. The drilling would be finished tomorrow or the next day, giving them water, but leaving them still weeks away from having anything that resembled adequate shelter. Even if he worked 18 hours a day, even if he could somehow afford materials, even if everything went perfectly, the math didn't add up. But giving up wasn't an option, because giving up meant losing Emma. Marcus had spent too many sleepless nights listening to her breathing, too many mornings watching her brave face as she adapted to circumstances that no 7-year-old should have to navigate to surrender now. The solution, when it came, would require every flavor he'd ever earned, every skill he'd ever learned, and a level of community support that would restore his faith in the possibility that people could still take care of each other when the systems designed to help them failed. But that was tomorrow's crisis. Tonight, Marcus held his sleeping daughter and tried to believe that tomorrow would bring the kind of breakthrough that desperate fathers sometimes found when they had nowhere left to retreat and everything worth fighting for still to lose. The breakthrough came at dawn on the third day of drilling, announced by a sound that Marcus would remember for the rest of his life, the sudden change in pitch as Danny's drill bit punched through the last layer of clay and hit something that made the entire rig shudder and buck like a living thing. "Shut it down!" Danny yelled, his voice carrying a note of alarm that made Marcus's blood run cold. "Something's wrong with the pressure!" The drilling rig shuddered to a halt, and for a moment the mountain was silent except for the sound of Marcus's heart hammering against his ribs. Then came another sound, a deep rumbling from somewhere beneath their feet, like the mountain itself was clearing its throat. Danny was already moving, disconnecting hoses and checking gauges with the quick efficiency of someone who'd seen equipment failures that could kill people in seconds. "Marcus, get back from the hole. Something's coming up, and it's coming up fast." The first indication of what they'd found came as a smell, not unpleasant but strange and somehow industrial, like the air around a gas station mixed with something that reminded Marcus of the geology lab he'd taken in community college years ago. Then came the sound of escaping gas, a high-pitched whistle that seemed to grow louder by the second. "Natural gas," Danny said, his voice filled with a mixture of amazement and concern. "Jesus Christ, Marcus, you've hit a gas pocket. A big one." The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. Natural gas meant energy, meant heat, meant the possibility of everything they needed to meet the social workers' demands and more. But it also meant danger, meant complications, meant a level of complexity that went far beyond anything he'd imagined when he bought 47 acres of apparently worthless hillside. "What do we do?" Marcus asked, watching gas bubble up through the water that was also flowing from the hole. Clear mountain water mixed with something that could power their entire homestead or kill them all if they made the wrong move. Danny was already on his phone, calling someone who apparently knew about gas wells and emergency procedures and the kind of problems that arose when you were drilling for water and accidentally struck something that belonged in the energy business rather than the construction business. "My buddy Jake handles gas wells for the county," Danny explained, ending his call. "He's on his way up here with equipment to test what we've got and make sure it's safe." "But Marcus, if this is what I think it is, if this is a significant gas reserve—" He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Marcus had grown up in coal country, had seen families go from poverty to prosperity overnight when someone discovered that the land they'd been farming for generations was sitting on top of resources that energy companies would pay extraordinary amounts to access. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity that felt like being caught in the middle of someone else's emergency. Jake Patterson arrived with a truck full of equipment and 3 assistants who treated the drilling site like it might explode at any moment. They tested the gas flow, measured the pressure, took samples of both the water and the gas for analysis. Sarah arrived home from dropping Emma at school to find their property invaded by people in hard hats who were treating their water well like it might be the most important hole in the ground in the entire county. The conversation that followed was conducted in hushed tones, while gas continued to bubble up from their accidental discovery, mixing with groundwater in ways that Jake assured them were perfectly safe as long as nobody lit any matches nearby. "How much gas?"
Sarah asked, after Jake had explained that what they discovered appeared to be a substantial natural gas reserve that extended well beyond the boundaries of their property. "We won't know for sure until we do seismic testing and bring in the big equipment," Jake said. "But based on the initial pressure readings and the flow rate, we're talking about something significant. Maybe very significant." The word significant hung in the air between them, carrying implications that neither Marcus nor Sarah was quite ready to process. Significant meant money. Significant meant energy companies and leasing agreements and the kind of financial security that it seemed impossible just hours ago. Significant meant that Marcus's desperate gamble on 47 acres of wilderness might have accidentally solved every problem they'd been facing. But it also meant complications. Jake explained that developing a gas well required permits, environmental impact studies, negotiations with energy companies, and a level of legal and technical expertise that went far beyond Marcus's experience as a construction worker. The process could take months or even years, and there was no guarantee that whatever they'd found could be extracted profitably. "In the meantime," Jake said, "you've got a well that's producing both water and gas, which creates some unique challenges. We need to cap the gas flow temporarily, install proper venting systems, and make sure you're not creating any safety hazards." The work continued through the afternoon, with Jake's crew installing equipment that would allow them to separate the gas from the water while maintaining safe pressure levels. Marcus watched the process with a mixture of fascination and anxiety, trying to understand what was happening to the land he'd bought for $600 and what it might mean for his family's future. Emma came home from school to find their property transformed into what looked like a small industrial site with trucks and equipment and people in hard hats doing mysterious things around a hole in the ground that had been a simple water well when she'd left that morning. "What's happening, Daddy?" she asked, taking his hand and studying the activity with the intense curiosity that 7-year-olds brought to anything that involved big machines and adults acting important. "We found something when we were digging our well, something that might help us build our house faster than we thought." "What kind of something?"
Natural gas. It's like, remember when we went camping last summer and we had the little stove that ran on those green bottles? This is like that, except it comes right out of the ground. Emma nodded seriously, apparently satisfied with this explanation, then ran off to explore the creek while the adults continued their discussions about pressure ratings and safety protocols and the bureaucratic maze that would have to be navigated before their accidental discovery could be turned into anything resembling a solution to their problems. That evening, after Jake's crew had left and Danny had finished capping the well with temporary equipment, Marcus and Sarah sat by their campfire trying to process what had happened. The smell of natural gas still lingered in the air, a constant reminder that their situation had changed in ways they were still trying to understand. "So what does this mean?" Sarah asked, stirring the fire with a stick and watching sparks spiral up into the darkness. "Are we rich now? Poor but sitting on something valuable? What?" Marcus had been asking himself the same question all day, trying to balance the possibilities against the realities of their immediate situation. Jake thinks we need to call some lawyers, maybe some energy companies, see what kind of offers we might get for leasing rights. But that could take months, and we've got 30 days to satisfy the social worker. Could we use the gas to heat a house, power a generator? Maybe. Jake said it would require special equipment, permits from the county, inspections to make sure everything's up to code. All things that take time and money we don't have. Sarah was quiet for a moment, watching Emma sleep in the Honda with the peaceful expression of someone whose biggest worry was whether tomorrow would bring another adventure as exciting as today. It feels like a cruel joke, doesn't it? We finally find something that could solve all our problems, but not in time to save us from the problems we've already got. The observation cut to the heart of their dilemma. The gas discovery might eventually provide the financial security they'd been desperate to find, but the bureaucracy and lead times involved in developing it meant that Emma would probably be in foster care long before they saw any benefit from their accidental windfall. Marcus poked at the fire, and tried to think like a construction worker instead of a dreamer. What could they actually accomplish in 30 days with the resources they had available? Even with natural gas for heating and power generation, they still needed lumber, insulation, windows, basic building materials that cost thousands of dollars they didn't have. But then he remembered something Frank Morrison had said about the early days of his marriage, about building their house by hand while living in a trailer and working construction jobs during the day. Frank and Betty had done it with determination and community support, with neighbors who understood that sometimes helping someone else succeed was the best way to ensure your own security in a place where everyone depended on everyone else to survive. I'm going to talk to Frank tomorrow, see if there's some way to turn this gas discovery into enough immediate help to get us through the next month. Maybe Jake knows people in the energy business who might be willing to advance us something against future royalties. Sarah nodded, but her expression remained skeptical. And if that doesn't work? Marcus looked at his daughter sleeping in the car that had been her bedroom for weeks now, and felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like snow that just kept falling until it threatened to bury everything he cared about. Then we figure something else out. We don't give up, Sarah. Not when we're this close to having something real.
The conversation continued past midnight. Two people trying to navigate a situation that had become more complex and more hopeful and more terrifying all at the same time. They talked about lawyers and energy companies and the bureaucratic maze that stood between their discovery and any practical benefit from it. They talked about building codes and safety inspections and the 30-day deadline that hung over everything like a sword. But mostly, they talked about Emma, about the life they wanted to build for her, about the balance between taking risks and providing security, about what it meant to be good parents when the definition of good parenting sometimes seemed to change based on circumstances beyond anyone's control. When they finally fell asleep, it was with the sound of natural gas still venting safely into the mountain air, a whisper of possibility that carried the promise of warmth and light, and the kind of energy that could power dreams into reality, if they could just figure out how to harness it in time. Marcus was trying to coax their camping stove to life with hands that shook from both cold and caffeine withdrawal when his phone buzzed against the picnic table they'd rescued from someone's roadside trash pile. "Mr. Chen, this is Jake Patterson. I need you and your wife to meet me in town this morning. There's something we need to discuss about your gas discovery, and it's not the kind of conversation we should have over the phone." The tone in Jake's voice made Marcus's stomach clench with the particular dread that comes from knowing someone is about to deliver news that will either save your life or destroy it completely. Jake had sounded professional but excited, like someone who'd spent all night double-checking calculations he couldn't quite believe. "Is it good news or bad news?" Marcus asked, watching Sarah emerge from the Honda with Emma's school clothes draped over her arm and the expression of someone who was getting tired of starting each day by pretending their situation was sustainable. "It's complicated news, the kind that requires lawyers and accountants and people who understand numbers with a lot of zeros behind them. Can you be at my office by 9? Marcus spent the drive down the mountain trying to prepare Sarah for a conversation he couldn't begin to predict. Jake's office was in a converted house on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where local contractors and well drillers conducted business that was too small for the big companies, but too important to handle over coffee at the diner. The conference room where Jake had assembled his materials looked like the command center for a military operation. Maps of their property and the surrounding area covered one wall, marked with colored pins and survey coordinates that meant nothing to Marcus, but apparently told a story that Jake found fascinating. A laptop computer displayed charts and graphs that looked like something from an engineering textbook, all pressure readings and flow rates and geological cross-sections. "Before we start," Jake said, settling into his chair with the careful movements of someone who'd been up most of the night, "I want you to understand that what I'm about to tell you is preliminary. We need more testing, more analyses, probably 6 months of additional work before we know exactly what we're dealing with." He turned the laptop so Marcus and Sarah could see the screen, which displayed a three-dimensional model of what appeared to be their property, rendered in blues and greens and reds that presumably meant something to people who understood geological surveys. Based on seismic data and the initial drilling results, we estimate that your property sits on top of a natural gas reserve that extends approximately 2 miles in each direction. The gas is trapped in a shale formation about 40 to 60 feet below the surface, which makes it relatively easy to extract with current technology. Marcus felt like he was listening to someone describe a movie he'd wandered into halfway through. None of this seemed connected to the desperate gamble he'd made 6 weeks ago, buying land with his last $600 because he'd run out of other options. "What does that mean in practical terms?" Sarah asked, her voice carefully controlled in the way that meant she was trying not to hope for something that might turn out to be too good to be true. Jake smiled for the first time since they'd arrived, the expression transforming his weathered face into something that looked like a man about to deliver the kind of news that people waited their entire lives to hear. "It means that, based on current natural gas prices and conservative estimates of the reserve size, you're sitting on approximately $190 million worth of recoverable natural gas." The number hit Marcus like a physical blow, so large and impossible that his brain couldn't quite process it. $190 million. More money than he'd ever imagined in his wildest fantasies, enough to solve every problem they'd ever had and most of the problems they might ever encounter. Sarah was staring at Jake like he just announced that aliens had landed in their front yard. "Did you say 190 million? That's a conservative estimate. Could be more, could be somewhat less, but we're talking about a reserve that would be considered significant even by industry standards, the kind of discovery that energy companies spend millions looking for." Marcus tried to speak, but found his throat had closed up completely. He cleared it twice before managing to croak out the question that mattered most. "How long before we could actually see any money from this?" "That depends on how you want to handle it. You could lease the rights to a major energy company, which would give you immediate signing bonuses and ongoing royalty payments, or you could develop it yourself, which would give you a larger percentage of the profits, but would require significant upfront investment and technical expertise." Jake pulled out another folder, this one containing what appeared to be sample contracts and lease agreements from other gas discoveries in the region. "I took the liberty of reaching out to some contacts in the energy industry. There are 3 major companies that would be interested in leasing your rights and 2 smaller independent operators who specialize in this kind of development. The preliminary offers I've received range from $5 million upfront plus 15% royalties to $12 million upfront plus 8% royalties." The numbers kept getting bigger and more surreal. Marcus found himself thinking about the eviction notice that had started this entire journey, the $2,400 monthly rent that had seemed impossible to manage just a few weeks ago. Now they were discussing signing bonuses that would buy 100 years of rent payments. "There's another option, and it's the one I'd recommend. You could form a partnership with one of the smaller operators, maintain a larger ownership stake, and develop the resource over time. It would mean less money immediately, but potentially much more in the long run." Sarah was taking notes on the back of an envelope, trying to keep track of numbers and percentages and time frames that would have seemed like science fiction yesterday morning. "How soon is immediately? We've got some urgent circumstances that need to be addressed."
Jake nodded, apparently understanding that people who were living in their car while drilling water wells probably had some pressing financial needs. "With the right energy company, you could have a signing bonus within 30 days. The paperwork is complicated, but these companies move fast when they want to secure rights to a significant discovery." 30 days. Marcus felt something that might have been hope beginning to stir in his chest for the first time since Janet Holbrook had delivered her ultimatum. 30 days to transform their situation from desperate to secure, from homeless to wealthy, from fighting for survival to planning for a future that suddenly seemed full of possibilities. The meeting continued for another hour, with Jake explaining the technical details of gas extraction, the environmental regulations they'd need to navigate, the tax implications of suddenly becoming wealthy through mineral rights. Marcus tried to follow the discussion, but his mind kept wandering to Emma, imagining the look on her face when he told her that their camping adventure had accidentally turned into the kind of treasure hunt that only happened in fairy tales. By the time they left Jake's office, Marcus was carrying a folder full of contracts and technical reports and contact information for lawyers and accountants and energy company representatives. The weight of the paperwork felt symbolic. Their lives had just become more complicated and more hopeful and more terrifying all at the same time. The drive back up the mountain was conducted in a silence that felt charged with possibility and disbelief. Sarah stared out the passenger window at landscapes that looked different now, knowing that somewhere beneath the trees and meadows lay resources that could change everything about their family's future. "Is this real?" she asked finally, as they pulled into their campsite where Emma's fairy houses still decorated the creek bank and their camping gear was scattered around the fire pit like evidence of a much simpler life. "I don't know," Marcus admitted. "It feels like something that happens to other people, not to families who buy land at county auctions because they're about to be evicted." They spent the afternoon reading through the contracts Jake had given them, trying to understand legal language that seemed designed to be as confusing as possible. The energy company offers were legitimate. Marcus recognized the names of two major corporations that advertised during football games and had stock prices listed in the financial section of newspapers. Emma came home from school to find her parents sitting at the picnic table with papers spread everywhere, both of them wearing the kind of shell-shocked expressions that suggested something major had happened while she was learning about long division and the water cycle. "What's all that?" she asked, dumping her backpack next to the fire pit and studying the contracts like they might contain homework assignments she'd forgotten about. Marcus looked at Sarah, both of them realizing they had no idea how to explain to a 7-year-old that their family had accidentally become wealthy while trying to drill a water well. "Remember how we found natural gas when we were digging our well? Well, it turns out we found a lot of natural gas, enough that some companies want to pay us money to use it." "How much money?" The directness of the question made Sarah laugh, the first genuine laughter she'd heard from her in weeks. "A lot," Sarah said. "Enough to build the house we've been planning, and probably enough to send you to any college you want to go to someday." Emma nodded seriously, processing this information with the matter-of-fact acceptance that children brought to news that would send adults into shock. "Does this mean we don't have to sleep in the car anymore?" "Not much longer," Marcus promised, holding her close and trying to believe that their luck had finally changed. "Daddy's going to build you the best bedroom any little girl ever had." That night, after Emma had fallen asleep to the sound of natural gas still venting safely from their accidental discovery, Marcus and Sarah sat by their campfire discussing a future that had been transformed in the space of a single morning. I know this story might seem too incredible to believe, but sometimes reality is stranger than fiction. If you're invested in finding out how this family's incredible journey ends, please share this story with someone who needs to hear that miracles can happen to ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges. The phone calls started the next day. Energy company representatives who'd heard about their discovery through the industry grapevine and wanted to schedule meetings to discuss lease agreements. Jake had apparently been busy since their morning conference, spreading word about the Chen family's accidental windfall to contacts throughout the regional energy business. The first meeting was with representatives from Appalachian Energy Corporation, a mid-sized company that specialized in developing natural gas reserves in rural areas. They arrived at the property in a convoy of SUVs that looked out of place navigating the rutted access road, and Marcus found himself apologizing for their accommodations while serving coffee around a campfire to executives wearing suits that probably cost more than his monthly construction salary had been. David Riley, the regional development manager, was a soft-spoken man in his 40s who seemed genuinely impressed by both the discovery and the circumstances that had led to it. "In 30 years in this business, I've never seen anything quite like this," he said, studying the temporary cap Jake had installed over their well. Usually, we're dealing with farmers who've known for generations that they had gas on their property, or energy companies that have spent millions on geological surveys. The idea of accidentally discovering a reserve of this magnitude while drilling for household water? It's like something out of a movie. The offer from Appalachian Energy was straightforward. $8 million upfront, plus 12% royalties on all gas extracted from the property. The contract would run for 20 years with options for renewal and would include provisions for additional bonus payments if the reserve proved larger than current estimates. $8 million, Sarah repeated, like she was testing how the word sounded. That's real money? In our bank account? Minus taxes and legal fees, yes, Riley confirmed. We could have the paperwork completed and the signing bonus transferred within 3 weeks. 3 weeks. More than enough time to satisfy Janet Holbrook's demands, more than enough time to build Emma a house that would make their current camping situation look like a distant memory. But Marcus had learned enough about construction and contracts to know that the first offer was rarely the best offer, and Jake had prepared him for the negotiation process. "We appreciate the offer," Marcus said, trying to sound more confident than he felt, "but we'd like to hear from the other companies that have expressed interest before we make any decisions." The meeting with Titan Gas Corporation the following day was a different experience entirely. Their representatives arrived with geological surveys and seismic equipment, conducting their own tests of the gas flow and pressure readings before discussing any financial arrangements. Rebecca Martinez, Titan's acquisitions director, was a sharp-eyed woman who clearly knew more about Marcus's financial situation than he was comfortable with. She said, "We understand you're facing some time pressures. We also understand that this discovery represents a life-changing opportunity for your family. Titan specializes in working with individual landowners who find themselves in exactly your situation."
Titan's offer was more complex, but potentially more lucrative. $12 million upfront, plus 8% royalties, plus a development partnership that would give the Chen family ongoing input into how the resource was extracted and managed. The difference, Martinez explained, is that you maintain more control over the long-term development of your property. Instead of just being passive recipients of royalty payments, you become active partners in a business that could generate income for your family for decades. The partnership aspect was appealing, but it also meant more responsibility, more technical knowledge required, more potential for complications that Marcus didn't feel equipped to handle. By the end of the week, they'd received offers from 5 different companies, ranging from immediate payouts to complex partnerships that could potentially be worth much more over time. Marcus spread the contracts across their camping table each evening, trying to compare terms and percentages and legal obligations that seemed designed to require advanced degrees in business and law to understand properly. The turning point came during a conversation with Frank Morrison, who'd been watching the parade of energy company vehicles navigating the mountain roads with the amused expression of someone who'd seen rural life intersect with big business before. "All these fancy contracts and signing bonuses," Frank said, settling onto a log by their fire with a cup of coffee that steamed in the cold mountain air. "You know what they really want, don't you?" Marcus admitted that the technical language and competing offers had left him more confused than enlightened. "They want to lock you into a deal before you fully understand what you've got. That gas deposit didn't just appear overnight. It's been there for millions of years, and it'll be there for millions more. The only thing that's urgent is their desire to secure the rights before you realize you're in the driver's seat." The conversation that followed was the most valuable education Marcus had received since Jake Patterson first explained what they discovered. Frank had grown up in coal country, had seen families become wealthy overnight, and families lose everything to companies that were better at writing contracts than the landowners were at reading them. "Here's what I'd do," Frank said, poking at the fire with a stick worn smooth by years of similar conversations. "Pick the company you trust most, not necessarily the one offering the most money up front. Make sure you understand every clause in that contract, especially the ones about environmental cleanup and long-term obligations. And most importantly, don't let them rush you into anything just because you've got bills to pay." The advice was sound, but Marcus still faced the reality of Janet Holbrook's 30-day deadline. Emma's welfare couldn't wait for the perfect contract negotiation, and their family's immediate needs had to be balanced against long-term financial optimization. The solution came from an unexpected source. Jake Patterson called on a Friday morning with news that one of his contacts in the state energy department had expedited the environmental review process for their site. Usually these things take 6 months, but given the unusual circumstances of your discovery and the quality of the gas samples, they've fast-tracked everything. You could have preliminary development permits within 2 weeks. 2 weeks to permits, 3 weeks to a signed contract, 4 weeks to a signing bonus that would transform their lives completely. The timeline was tight, but for the first time since Janet Holbrook's visit, Marcus felt like they had a realistic path forward. The contract they ultimately signed was with Appalachian Energy, modified after days of negotiation to include better royalty terms and stronger environmental protections. $8 million upfront, 15% royalties instead of 12%, and provisions that allowed the Chen family to maintain some control over how their property was developed. The signing took place in a lawyer's office in town, with Emma fidgeting in a chair that was too big for her, while adults shuffled papers that would change her life forever. She'd been patient with the whole process, treating the constant meetings and phone calls like an extended version of the business games she sometimes played with her dolls. When David Riley finally handed Marcus a cashier's check for $8 million, Emma looked at it with the kind of academic interest she might show a particularly large leaf or an unusually shaped rock. "Is that the money?" she asked. "That's the money," Marcus confirmed, staring at numbers that still didn't seem real, even printed on official bank documents. "Can we build our house now?" "We can build our house now." The check felt heavier than it should have as Marcus carried it to the bank where they'd been struggling to maintain a checking account balance above zero for the past 6 months. The bank manager, who'd been politely declining their loan applications, suddenly became very interested in discussing investment opportunities and financial planning services. By the time they drove back up the mountain, their bank account had been transformed from desperate to secure. Their credit rating had jumped from terrible to excellent, and their daughter had gone from potentially homeless to potentially one of the wealthiest 7-year-olds in the county. But the most significant change was in how they looked at their land. What had been 47 acres of wilderness that they'd bought in desperation was now 47 acres of valuable resource property that energy companies considered worth fighting over. The trees and meadows and creek that had seemed like obstacles to overcome were now assets to be protected and developed carefully. Emma ran ahead of them up the hill to their camping site, her voice echoing off the mountains as she called back, "Can I have a big window in my new bedroom so I can see the fairy houses by the creek?" Marcus and Sarah looked at each other and started laughing. Not the stressed, slightly hysterical laughter that had gotten them through the worst of their financial crisis, but the kind of deep, relieved laughter that comes from realizing that the worst is finally over and the best is just beginning. "She can have whatever kind of windows she wants," Sarah said, taking Marcus's hand as they walked up the hill toward their daughter and their future. "She can have whatever kind of anything she wants." The natural gas continued venting safely from their well, a whisper of wealth that had transformed their desperate gamble into the kind of success story that would be told around kitchen tables and campfires for generations. But more than the money, more than the security, and more than the vindication of Marcus's impulsive decision to buy land they couldn't afford, was the knowledge that they'd survived their worst crisis and emerged stronger as a family. The house they would build, the life they would create, the legacy they would leave for Emma, all of it was possible now because a man who'd run out of options had placed one final bet on a piece of land that nobody else wanted and accidentally discovered that sometimes the most desperate decisions turn out to be the wisest ones. That evening, sitting around their campfire with Emma asleep in the Honda and the sound of natural gas still whispering promises from their well, Marcus and Sarah began planning not just the house, but a future that stretched beyond anything they dared to imagine during those desperate weeks when survival had seemed like an optimistic goal. $8 million, Sarah said, testing the words like they were in a foreign language she was still learning to speak. Plus royalties that could be worth tens of millions more over the next 20 years. Marcus poked at the fire, watching sparks spiral up towards stars that seemed closer and brighter than they'd ever looked from their old apartment. You know what the crazy thing is? I keep thinking we should celebrate, but I'm scared to believe it's real. Like if we act too happy about it, someone's going to realize there was a mistake and take it all back. Janet Holbrook won't be able to take Emma away now, Sarah said quietly. We can build her a house with heat and running water and her own bedroom with princess wallpaper if she wants it. We can build her 10 houses. We can build her a castle if she wants it. But even as they talked about the possibilities their windfall had created, both of them understood that the real victory wasn't measured in dollars or square footage or the kind of security that money could buy. The real victory was that they'd faced the worst crisis of their lives together, had come closer to losing everything than either of them had ever admitted, and had somehow found their way to the other side with their family intact. The contracts with Appalachian Energy included provisions for ongoing development of the gas field that would bring additional revenue and employment opportunities to the area. Frank Morrison's son, Tommy, would be hired to provide lumber for the infrastructure projects. Danny Kowalski's drilling business would be contracted to sink additional wells as the field was developed. Even Janet Holbrook would eventually benefit, as the taxes on Marcus's newfound wealth would fund county services, including the social services department that had nearly separated his family. We need to hire Jake Patterson to manage the gas development, Marcus said, already thinking about the responsibilities that came with sudden wealth. And probably a financial advisor to help us figure out how to handle the money, and lawyers to make sure we don't get taken advantage of by people who are smarter about contracts than we are. Sarah laughed, the sound carrying pure joy for the first time in months. Remember when our biggest financial decision was whether we could afford to buy name-brand cereal instead of the store brand? Now we're talking about hiring teams of advisors to manage our portfolio. The transformation felt surreal, but it also felt earned. They hadn't won the lottery or inherited wealth from a distant relative. They'd discovered their fortune through sheer determination to provide for their daughter, through the willingness to take risks when playing it safe meant certain failure, through the kind of stubborn hope that kept people working when logic suggested they should give up. As the fire died down to glowing coals, Marcus walked to the Honda where Emma was sleeping peacefully. Her face relaxed in the way that only children could manage when the adults in their lives were finally able to stop worrying about tomorrow. He listened to her steady breathing, thinking about the bedroom he would build for her, the playhouse he could construct by the creek, the college fund that would ensure she never had to choose between education and financial security the way her parents had been forced to do. But more than anything, he thought about the morning when he would wake her up and tell her that their camping adventure was almost over, that Daddy was ready to build the house he'd been promising for so long, and that she would never again have to worry about whether her family had a place to call home. The natural gas continued its quiet whisper from the depths of the earth, a sound that had become as familiar as the creek's murmur or the wind in the trees. But now it sang of possibilities instead of problems, of futures instead of fears, of the kind of happy ending that Marcus had stopped believing in during those desperate weeks when hope itself had seemed like a luxury they couldn't afford. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Wealth created its own problems, and sudden financial security could be almost as disorienting as sudden poverty. There would be decisions to make about investments and taxes and the kind of lifestyle they wanted to build with their newfound resources. There would be relationships to navigate with people who might treat them differently now that they were wealthy. There would be the responsibility of using their good fortune wisely, of making sure that Emma grew up understanding both the value of money and the values that were more important than money.
Secrets to people desperate enough to dig for water and lucky enough to find treasure instead. The fairy houses Emma had built by the creek caught moonlight and held it like captured stars, small monuments to the imagination and resilience that had sustained them through their darkest days. Soon she would have a real house to match her fairy houses, with windows that looked out over the creek and walls that would keep her safe through whatever storms lay ahead. And deep beneath the earth, the natural gas that had made it all possible continued its ancient sleep, waiting to power the dreams of a family who had learned that sometimes the most desperate gambles yield the most extraordinary rewards. Secrets to people desperate enough to dig for water and lucky enough to find treasure instead. The fairy houses Emma had built by the creek caught moonlight and held it like captured stars, small monuments to the imagination and resilience that had sustained them through their darkest days. Soon she would have a real house to match her fairy houses, with windows that looked out over the creek and walls that would keep her safe through whatever storms lay ahead. And deep beneath the earth, the natural gas that had made it all possible continued its ancient sleep, waiting to power the dreams of a family who had learned that sometimes the most desperate gambles yield the most extraordinary rewards.
Frank's generosity extended beyond shelter. He proposed a partnership, help him dig a well on his property, and he'd help Marcus drill one on theirs. This collaboration would provide Marcus with crucial experience while splitting drilling costs between the two families. Danny Kowalski, Frank's drilling contractor friend, arrived with equipment that could punch through 60 feet of mountain soil and rock. For 2 days, the rhythmic percussion of the drill bit echoed across the mountainside as they worked toward Frank's water table at 42 feet, celebrating when clear, cold mountain water bubbled up from the depths. When drilling began on Marcus's property, everything proceeded normally until the 3rd day, when Danny's drill bit punched through clay at 45 feet and hit something unexpected. The rig shuddered violently, pressure gauges spiked, and a strange industrial smell filled the air. "Natural gas," Danny announced with amazement and concern. "Jesus Christ, Marcus, you've hit a gas pocket, a big one." The immediate priority was safety. Jake Patterson, the county's gas well expert, rushed to the site with testing equipment and assistants who treated the area like it might explode. Initial pressure readings and flow rates suggested something extraordinary, not just a small gas pocket, but a substantial reserve that could extend well beyond their property boundaries. But their moment of potential triumph was overshadowed by crisis. Janet Holbrook, from Child Protective Services, arrived investigating reports about Emma's living conditions following her pneumonia hospitalization. Janet's inspection of their camping setup was thorough and damning. Inadequate heating, no running water, no proper sanitation facilities. Her ultimatum was stark: demonstrate significant improvement in Emma's living situation within 30 days or face losing custody of their daughter. 3 days later, Jake Patterson's call would transform their understanding of what they'd accidentally discovered. The laboratory analysis revealed 92% methane, extremely high-quality natural gas. Seismic testing suggested reserves extending 2 miles in each direction, trapped in easily accessible shale formations. Jake's conservative estimate was staggering: approximately $190 million worth of recoverable natural gas lay beneath their 47 acres of desperate purchase. Within days, energy company representatives were navigating the mountain roads to meet with a family who'd gone from homeless to potentially wealthy overnight. Appalachian Energy Corporation, Titan Gas Corporation, and 3 other companies made competing offers ranging from $5 million to $12 million upfront, plus ongoing royalty percentages that could generate income for decades. Frank Morrison's advice proved invaluable during negotiations. Having grown up in coal country, he'd seen families become wealthy overnight and families lose everything to companies better at writing contracts than landowners were at reading them. Pick the company you trust most, not necessarily the one offering the most money up front, he counseled. The Chen family ultimately signed with Appalachian Energy for $8 million up front, plus 15% royalties, with strong environmental protections and community benefit provisions. When Marcus carried the cashier's check to the bank where they'd been struggling to maintain a positive balance, their account was transformed from desperate to secure. Their credit rating jumped from terrible to excellent. The first lumber trucks arrived on a Tuesday morning in late November, carrying Douglas fir beams and cedar siding up the mountain with precious cargo care. The house Marcus and Sarah designed wasn't a mansion. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, an open kitchen and living area for family gatherings and community meetings, solar panels for electricity, geothermal heating powered by their own natural gas, and windows positioned to capture morning sun and views of Emma's fairy kingdom by the creek.
But wealth came with responsibility they took seriously. Emma's bedroom featured a window seat where she could read and watch deer grazing in their meadow. The kitchen included a wood-fired stove where Sarah could bake bread and cook meals that filled the house with the smells of home. Marcus designed a workshop where he could continue construction projects for neighbors who needed help but couldn't afford big contractors. Janet Holbrook's follow-up visit found a construction site instead of a camping area, a family whose housing situation had been transformed from precarious to enviable. Her report would recommend closing Emma's case, noting they'd exceeded county standards for child welfare. The gas royalties exceeded all projections. Monthly checks already approached Marcus's best annual construction earnings, and the field was barely 5% developed. The steady income funded their most meaningful project, the Mountain Homestead Initiative, providing financial assistance, construction training, and technical support to families who wanted to create self-sufficient homesteads on rural properties. Frank Morrison became the program's first volunteer coordinator, sharing decades of mountain construction knowledge. Danny Kowalski offered drilling services at cost. Tommy Morrison provided wholesale lumber and construction training. Emma, now 8 and fully recovered, became the program's unofficial mascot, showing new families around the property and explaining how fairy houses were built. By spring following their gas discovery, the Mountain Homestead Initiative had helped 6 families purchase land and begin construction. Success stories included a single mother building a 3-bedroom house with garden and chicken coop, a retired couple constructing a home designed for aging in place, and a young family creating a homestead for their organic vegetable business. The program's success attracted attention from rural development organizations and philanthropic foundations. Emma's college fund grew to cover any university in the country, but she was developing interests in sustainable agriculture and community development that suggested she might build her life around her parents' work. Sarah enrolled in nonprofit management classes, while Marcus was approached about writing a book sharing their story as inspiration for other families facing similar challenges. But their most meaningful measure of success was the quiet satisfaction of creating something lasting that would benefit their community long after the gas field was depleted. Additional geological surveys revealed even larger reserves, potential lifetime royalties reaching hundreds of millions of dollars, transforming their accidental windfall into generational wealth. But Marcus and Sarah had learned to handle sudden wealth responsibly, balancing personal security with community benefit. They negotiated expansion agreements with Appalachian Energy that included the strongest environmental protections ever written into a regional gas development contract: strict limits on noise and air pollution, requirements for reforestation and habitat restoration, guarantees that additional royalty percentages would fund conservation programs and community development initiatives. Most importantly, the agreement established the Chen family as partners in long-term resource management rather than passive landowners. Marcus would serve on the Environmental Compliance Oversight Committee, Sarah would coordinate community benefit programs, and Emma would inherit active responsibility for ensuring their good fortune continued serving the broader community. Emma, now 29 and married, serves as executive director of the Mountain Homestead Initiative, which operates in 12 states and has helped more than 800 families transition from housing insecurity to land ownership. Her daughter Maya, 7 years old, represents the 3rd generation growing up on land purchased in desperation and transformed through persistence, luck, and community support. The original 47-acre property has become headquarters for a rural development model studied by organizations across the country.
Marcus, his hair silver but hands still calloused from construction work, splits time between building projects and consulting for rural development organizations. Sarah, recognized as a leading expert in community-based rural development, continues as founding board chair while pursuing consulting work with other philanthropic organizations.